this one's going to linger. Get comfortable. Let the cold fade away. Slow down. Breathe it in. And when you're ready, baby, dream of a new life.
Cabin Life, Borrowed Heat by Catherine Serafina. Chapter 10, Salt and Cinnamon, Part 1. The first morning back felt almost normal. I was standing by the stove, slicing thin strips of smoked venison while the kettle warmed beside me, when Shane and Davis started in on the story again. I didn't even catch the beginning of it this time. They were already arguing over details before I realized what they were talking about. "I'm telling you," Shane said, pointing his fork at Davis like it was evidence in a courtroom, "if he hadn't stepped exactly there, none of it would have happened." Davis rolled his eyes. He stepped there because he wasn't watching where he was going. That's not the point. That's absolutely the point. I had to bite back a smile. They'd been like this since we got back animated, overlapping, correcting each other over tiny details as if accuracy was sacred. I turned slightly so I could see them both. "Are we doing this story again?" "It deserves to be told properly," Shane said. Davis shook his head but leaned forward anyway. They were ready to leave. That's what matters. They'd checked every building, nothing useful, no food, no tools, just empty storefronts and boarded windows. "Morale was gone," Shane added. "Completely," Davis agreed. They were packing up. I rested my hip against the counter, knife still in hand. And then? Shane grinned like he'd been there himself. One of them, walking alone through a building, steps right through rotten floorboards. Whole leg punches straight down. "Broke his ankle?" Davis said. "Bad." "They go in to pull him out," Shane continued, getting more animated by the second. "And one of them notices there's space underneath. Not crawl space, a room." "A full basement," Davis corrected. I raised an eyebrow. "Hidden?" Davis nodded. "Hidden door, stairs down, and when they got down there..." He paused just long enough to make it dramatic. "It was stocked. Canned food, jars, tools," Shane said. "Medical supplies, salt, spices, stuff nobody thought they'd find anymore." I laughed softly, all because someone wasn't watching where he stepped. "Exactly," Shane said, pleased with himself. "That's not the moral," Davis muttered. But he was smiling too. "They called it lucky break," Shane finished. I shook my head. "That's terrible." "It's perfect," Davis said. "It's literal," I countered. "That's why it works." The cabin felt warmer than it had in weeks, not just because of the stove. Steam curled up from the kettle. The smell of meat filled the room. Snow pressed quietly against the windows, not howling or threatening, just settling. "Anyway," Shane said, leaning back in his chair, "if you ever start to lose hope, just remember, sometimes you have to fall through the floor first." I looked at him, then at Davis. "Let's not test that theory here," I said. They both laughed. And for a little while, the world felt small enough to hold. The days after that morning started to blur together in the best way. Not in the way they had at the beginning, when everything felt unstable and strange and I was constantly waiting for the next change. This was different. This was rhythm. Wake up, feed the stove, eat, work, come back before dark. Repeat. Somewhere in those weeks, I lost another 2 inches. Let's hope that was the last. There wasn't a moment where I felt myself shrink. It was more like I kept standing next to things I'd measured myself against before, the edge of the doorframe, the shelf near the stove, and noticing I wasn't quite where I used to be. One afternoon, Shane came up behind me while I was rinsing something in the basin and wrapped his arms around me. His chin rested lower than it used to. He noticed. "You're smaller," he said quietly. "I am not." "You are." I turned just enough to look at him. "You're just getting taller." He laughed softly and held me tighter. "No, I like this." By the time I checked properly, I was 5'3". I didn't let myself assume that meant anything, but it felt closer to finished than I'd ever felt before. Life in the cabin had settled into something close to peaceful. We hunted when we needed to, fished when we could, kept the traps closest to the cabin in rotation. The snow came and went in waves. The stove kept burning. And then there was Laurel. Kyle and William came by one morning with plans to check lines farther out. It made sense for the three of them to go together. And before I knew it, I was pulling my coat on while William waited near the door, offering to walk me back to their place. I hadn't expected to feel nervous. Laurel opened the door before we even knocked. She must have seen us coming through the trees. She was younger than I'd imagined, mid to late 30s maybe. There was something steady about her, not soft exactly, capable. The kind of woman who had already adjusted to this world and wasn't waiting for it to change back. She didn't stare at me, didn't hesitate. She just stepped aside and said, "Come in, you must be freezing." Her cabin was smaller than ours, but cleaner in a way that felt intentional. Everything had a place, nothing wasted. We talked while she prepared lunch, about snow patterns, about how hard it was to keep flour dry, about nothing and everything at once. And somewhere in that quiet conversation, it struck me. This was the first time in my life I had ever sat across from another woman as a woman. Not pretending. Not imagining. Not wishing. Just sitting there. Listening. Talking. Existing. There was no ceremony to it. No dramatic realization. Just a quiet sense that I fit in the space between her words. When I walked back later that afternoon, something in me felt steadier than it had before. Like the world had shifted half an inch and finally clicked into alignment. But not everything had settled. Shane noticed it first. "He drifted again today," he said one evening, unlacing his boots near the door. I had to call his name twice before he answered. I'd noticed it too, though in smaller ways. Davis would pause in the middle of splitting wood and just stop, stare at the tree line, forget what he'd been about to say, stand by the window longer than necessary. One night, Davis stepped outside to bring in more firewood. I remember noticing it because the stove had burned low, and the room had that hollow chill creeping back in around the edges. The door shut behind him, and for a while there was only the soft scrape of snow shifting on the roof and the faint hiss of the kettle settling on the back of the stove. I didn't think anything of it at first. But after a minute or two, Shane's head lifted slightly. He didn't look at me, just toward the door. "Head in the clouds," he muttered. Another moment passed before the latch turned. Davis came back in brushing snow from his shoulders, stomping once at the threshold before closing the door. He walked 2 steps into the room before either of us said anything. His hands were empty. I didn't mean for it to sound like a correction. The wood? He blinked at me, genuinely confused for half a second, then looked down at his hands as if the logs might appear there if he stared long enough. Oh. There was no defensiveness, no irritation, just the quiet realization that he'd forgotten why he'd gone out in the first place. He nodded once to himself and stepped back outside without a word. Shane and I didn't exchange a look. We didn't need to. The cabin was warm. Our rhythm was steady. But some part of Davis was still standing in another place entirely. And neither of us had to say whose name lived there. I woke to Shane saying my name. Not loudly, not urgently, but wrong. There's a tone people get when something isn't right. When they're trying not to panic and failing anyway. Laney. I made a soft sound, still half under sleep, and rolled slightly toward him. It was still dim in the room. The light outside that pale gray that meant morning hadn't fully decided itself yet. Laney. This time I opened my eyes. He was propped up on one elbow, staring down at the bed between us. "What?" I mumbled. He didn't answer immediately. His hand hovered, uncertain, then pulled the blanket back just enough for me to see what he was seeing. Blood. It took a second for my brain to catch up. Not a lot, not violent, not dramatic, just enough to stain the sheet beneath me. Shane's voice dropped lower. Are you hurt? For one disoriented heartbeat, I didn't understand the question. Then everything clicked. Oh. I pushed myself up slightly, the fog in my head clearing all at once. My body felt normal. No sharp pain, no dizziness, just a dull, unfamiliar heaviness low in my abdomen. I looked back at the sheet. And then I started to laugh. Not loudly, not hysterically, just soft and breathless. Shane stared at me. Why are you laughing? I'm not hurt. Laney, I'm not hurt, I repeated, and reached for his wrist to steady him more than myself. It took another second before realization dawned across his face. Oh, yeah. We sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling in. This wasn't like the other changes. This wasn't gradual height or subtle reshaping. This was biological, predictable, ordinary. My heart felt strangely light. I hadn't known I was waiting for something like this until it happened. Shane exhaled long and slow. So that means... I tilted my head slightly. That means I have a uterus that works. He swallowed. And that means... I saw it coming before he finished. Does this mean we can have sex now? The look on his face was so hopeful and so completely sincere that I couldn't even be mad. I smacked his shoulder. Shane? What? It's a reasonable question? I shook my head, still smiling. Yes, it means that. Eventually. Eventually? Maybe not today, I said dryly. He groaned quietly. You're killing me. I literally just started bleeding. That's fair. I held his gaze for a second longer, then added softer this time. It also means I can probably get pregnant now. That wiped the exaggerated disappointment off his face instantly. Oh, yeah. We both went quiet for a moment. The words sat there between us. Pregnant. It wasn't frightening exactly, just big. Shane's thumb traced a slow circle at my hip. That's not something we should rush into. I huffed a small laugh. Understatement. He searched my face carefully. Do you? Not yet, I said quickly, and meant it. Maybe someday, but not yet. He nodded once, relieved but thoughtful. Not yet. The way he said it wasn't dismissive. It was future-facing. And that did something warm and complicated inside my chest. See, I said lightly after a beat. So maybe waiting a couple days isn't the worst idea. He exhaled a quiet laugh. Fine, responsible adult decisions. Terrible, I know. I reached up and brushed my fingers through his hair. You're okay? He asked again, more gently this time. I nodded. More than okay. For the first time since all of this started, there wasn't a part of me waiting for something else to change. I felt finished, or as close to it as I was ever gonna get. I leaned forward and kissed him slowly, deliberately. Not rushed, not heated, just present. He responded in kind, one hand sliding to my waist, careful and grounding. When we pulled apart, the light in the room had shifted slightly brighter. Go clean up, he murmured. Bossy? He smiled faintly. Concerned? I slipped out of bed, steady on my feet. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, just a quiet certainty settling into place. When I stepped into the small washroom and closed the door behind me, I paused in front of the mirror. For a second, I just stood there. Then, almost without thinking, I lifted the hem of my shirt slightly, tugged my bottoms down just enough to see the lines of my hips, the soft curve of my waist, the shape I'd grown used to over these past months. Nothing looked different. Not really. This was the body I'd been waking up in for a while now. The one I'd adjusted to inch by inch. The one that had slowly become familiar. I studied myself, searching for some visible marker of finality. There wasn't one. And yet, something felt undeniably changed. Complete. I let my shirt fall back into place and rested my hands lightly against the edge of the sink. I was still trying to name the feeling, trying to understand why this moment felt heavier than all the others, when I finally lifted my gaze to my reflection. That's when I noticed it. I was smiling, not just a small, polite curve of the lips. I'd been smiling for a while. The realization hit gently. That was my answer. Whatever else this world had taken, it had given me this. And I didn't have to wonder anymore how I felt about it. When I stepped back into the main room, the cabin felt unchanged. Warm near the stove, cold near the door, the familiar rhythm of morning settling in around us. Shane looked up immediately when I came out, his eyes flicking over me quickly. Not nervous anymore, just checking. "You okay?" "Yeah." He nodded once, satisfied, and came to stand near me while I started breakfast. His hand found my waist without thinking. My shoulder brushed his chest when I reached for the pan. It was easy, comfortable, natural. Davis came out a few minutes later. He paused just inside the doorway. It wasn't long, barely a second, but I saw it. The way his eyes took in the space between us, how close Shane was standing, how settled we looked without even trying. There was no jealousy in it, just comparison. And something tightening quietly behind his eyes before he moved on. "Morning," he said, crossing to the table. "Morning," Shane replied. When I set the plates down, steam rose up between us. The smell of venison filled the small space. "Smells good," Davis said. I gave him a look. "It's the same thing we've been eating for weeks." He shrugged lightly. "Still smells good." Shane snorted. "We should head down to the lake again soon. Try for more perch. Maybe stockpile a bit this time. Give ourselves something different for a while." "That'd be nice," I agreed. "Wouldn't hurt to have options." Davis didn't respond. Not right away. He was staring at his plate like he'd forgotten it was there. Shane noticed first. "You good?" Davis blinked and looked up. "Yeah." But he didn't pick up his fork. After a moment, he set it down instead. "I need to go back to Lucky Break." The words didn't break the room. They just settled into it. Shane leaned back slightly. "Soon?" Davis nodded once. "Yeah, I've been putting it off. I shouldn't have." He ran a hand over his jaw as he spoke, not defensive, just honest. "I don't know how she's doing," he admitted. "That's the problem." The cabin went quiet around that. "I know she's strong," he added quickly. "She's handled worse than most people there, but being strong and being alone aren't the same thing." He looked down at his hands. "I'm gonna worry either way." I softened. "She made it this far," I said gently. "That counts for something." He nodded once. "I know." But the worry didn't leave his face. Shane straightened slightly. "You're not going alone." Davis glanced up. "I'm not leaving Laney alone again," Shane continued, calm but firm. "Not for that long." The words weren't possessive. They were protective. Davis gave a small nod. He understood. "I was thinking of going with Kyle," he continued after a moment. "He mentioned he wanted to make another trip. Trade. Check on some things. Makes sense to go together?" That did make sense. Kyle had reasons to go. Davis had his own. "How long?" I asked. "Couple days," he said. 3 at most, if weather holds." I studied him quietly. There was no strategy behind this. No angle. Just worry. "Then go," I said quietly. "Check on her. Make sure she's okay." He held my gaze for a second longer than usual, something steadying in his expression. "I will." And just like that, the next step felt inevitable. Davis left the next morning with Kyle just after first light. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no speeches, just extra gloves, checked packs, the quiet ritual of men who had made enough trips like this to know what mattered. 3 days, Shane reminded him. 3, Davis agreed. The snow swallowed their footsteps quickly after they disappeared into the trees. The cabin felt different without him. Not empty. Just quieter. Shane stood at the door a few seconds longer than necessary before shutting it and sliding the bolt into place. When he turned around, the look he gave me wasn't anxious. It was aware. We moved through the day normally, checked the closer traps, brought in wood, cleaned what needed cleaning. But the quiet between us was heavier now. Anticipatory. That night, when we lay down, there wasn't the same hesitation there had been before. No unspoken boundary left to cross. We didn't rush it. We didn't need to. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't even as overwhelming as I'd once imagined it might be. It was steady. There was a strange moment somewhere in the middle of it where my mind flickered back, not to compare in any bitter way, but simply because memory exists. Because I knew what it had once felt like to be on the other side of something like this. And then that thought slipped away just as easily. This felt right. Different in ways I didn't have words for. Softer, more consuming, less about action and more about closeness. Afterward, when we lay tangled together under the blankets, the cabin warm around us and the world reduced to the small circle of firelight, Shane brushed his thumb slowly along my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I smiled into his chest. Yeah, more than okay. The world outside might have been frozen solid, but in that small room, in that narrow bed, I felt something undeniably alive. And for the first time, there was no question mark attached to it.
Sometimes peace arrives quietly.
Still lost in the dream, aren't you? Don't worry, I've got plenty more where that came from. Sweet, sexy, transformative little dreams. All just a click away. And if you're craving the naughty versions, the ones too hot for YouTube, you know exactly where to find them. On my Patreon. I'll be waiting, gorgeous.